So if this was a supposedly common or somewhat common cultural practice, you would think that it would have left more traces in the evidence, but that doesn't seem to be the case, even if we look at tens of thousands of pre-Islamic Arabian inscriptions and tens of thousands of verses of pre-Islamic Arabic poetry. We don't encounter any mentions of such a habit. And one of the reasons it wasn't widespread was probably that because many Arabians, even in the 5th and 6th centuries, were actually Jews and Christians whose scriptures also forbade the practice. Sometimes it is the whole pre-Islamic Arabs as a group that is ascribed the practice or crime of female infanticide. Sometimes it's a specific tribe. And so Arabia is it's a huge landmass. So there's has been and is a lot of cultural diversity there. And many people did not identify as Arab in pre-Islamic Arabia. That seems to be the case, especially if you look at Sabek inscriptions in the south.
Peace, everyone, and welcome back to another installment of the Real Talk podcast, where we bring academic insights on Islam to the curious mind. I'm your host, Tehran, and joined by my brilliant co-host, Roxana. In this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Dr. Ilkka Lindstedt about a topic that is often taken for granted in both popular and scholarly accounts of pre-Islamic Arabia: the idea that it was common for families to bury their infant daughters alive. Dr. Lindstedt has written a couple of articles, one of which was published in the Journal of International Quranic Studies Association, which takes a hard look at the Quran, early Arabic poetry, and the historical record, and asks, how sure are we that this actually happened the way it's been told? It's a subject that touches on how the pre-Islamic past has been imagined, the moral narrative of Jahiliyyah, and the way scholars handle long-standing traditions. So, Dr. Lindstedt, what was the moment for when you started thinking, I'm not sure this story about pre-Islamic female infanticide actually holds up? Was it a particular source, a gap in the evidence, or something you read in another field?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, Tehran and Roxana, many thanks for inviting me back to Skeps Islamica. I'm very happy to be here. I think the whole subject goes back to 10 years or so in my case. So I was invited to write a chapter for the Routledge Handbook to Early Islam on pre-Islamic Arabia. And one of the things that I was reading on was this very topic, the practice or purported practice of female infanticide, which appears quite commonly, especially in popular literature nowadays, also quite often in scholarly literature nowadays. I'm not sure it's so common in the medieval Arabic literature. It is somewhat common, but I think it has sort of gotten more popular as a narrative and a notion, and we can discuss it further during this talk in today's world. That's my 5 cents at least. Eventually I didn't really write anything on the topic for that article, but it really got me thinking about the whole Jahiliyyah or pre-Islamic Arabia. Jahiliyyah, of course, translates to ignorance or the age of ignorance, which alone tells something about how many medieval Muslim scholars saw pre-Islamic Arabia. Quite often when I'm researching a new topic or a new concept or a word, I go to my Arabic dictionary, classical Arabic dictionary by Ibn Manthur, a 14th century scholar. I think he died in the early 14th century. The dictionary is called Lisan al-Arab, or the language of the Arabs, right? And it's just this vast, rich ocean of words and notions and phenomena. And the great thing about it is that Ibn Mandur, like many other lexicographers, cite a lot of evidence. So they basically not only go through the meanings of the word, but they say where it appears. They cite a lot of poetry quite often, some hadith, some Quranic verses sometimes. So that's sort of the what these dictionaries are about. So I went to the word waʿd, or the verb is wa'ada, which in classical Arabic is often means to bury an infant alive, quite often an infant daughter. And I realized that the word waʿd, which is the noun for this practice, also means other things. And there was quite a lot of also evidence cited for those other things, and especially the meanings of emitting a loud sound or treading and thus emitting a loud sound were sort of the meanings that were adduced by Ibn Mandur in his dictionary. So that got me thinking 10 years back or so about the semantic field of that word, waʿd. I mean, Arabic words quite often have quite expansive semantic fields, and they can, have a lot of different meanings which have nothing to do with each other. But this seemed quite weird to me, I must say. Emit a loud sound or tread on the one hand, and then on the other hand, to bury an infant alive. That seemed to me quite odd, and that struck me, and was sort of the impetus to start to study this issue. But it took me 10 years to finally actually to go to this topic and write the article, which eventually became 2 articles, and one is still forthcoming.
Just to set this whole topic into a larger context, you discuss in your first article how infanticide was a common monotheist literary topos in Jewish and Christian texts prior to Islam. What was the function of this topos in these texts? And to what extent does historical evidence from antiquity support the idea that infanticide was widespread in the late antique context?
Yeah, that's a good question. In the Jewish and Christian scriptures, there's quite often the idea that it's in particular, or this appears in Hebrew Bible, for instance, it is in particular the pagans who are committing this crime of infanticide. It's quite often linked directly in the sort of textual plane, at least, to idol worship. So in the sense that sometimes it's portrayed that you sacrifice these daughters or sons to the false deities, but sometimes they are just sort of part and parcel of the immoral and wrong worldview of the pagans. And of course, this is not my field, but from what I've read, it seems that many scholars of Judaism and Christianity in antiquity and late antiquity think that this was quite often a literary trope. So it doesn't mean, even though the texts might say this and ascribe these habits to the pagans, it doesn't necessarily mean that the pagans were any more sort of eager to kill their children. Even though it has to be said that there's quite a lot of literature on infanticide and infant abandonment in antiquity, and there, if I've understood the scholarship on the topic correctly, it was often understood to be the sort of privilege of, or among the sort of rights of the male household to decide if the if the infants get to leave, or if in dire situations or for other reasons they be abandoned. And apparently this was in the Greco-Roman world, this was commonly discussed, at least by various authors, as something that was taking place. It was not always sort of thought to be morally repugnant necessarily. It was sort of deemed to be among the sort of, I don't know, privileges or rights that of the male household, the pater familias, to decide what happens to the children that are born. And of course, we have to understand that this is a world that lacks any birth control, where food scarcity is quite common, food crisis also, and many children were born. So in those cases, it was probably quite often families that were in very dire straits. There were horrible famine, for instance, going on, and they already had 4 kids. Those families might then have resorted to infanticide or infant abandonment.
You mentioned a really interesting work in your article. You bring up Eleanor Scott's point that a lot of evidence for infanticide in the ancient world is pretty shaky and open to different readings. And reading your work on waḥd al-banāt, I couldn't help but see a similar theme going on. That you're basically saying, are we sure the sources actually support this? Was Scott's way of looking at it, looking at the material, something that influenced you here, or is it just that you both ended up challenging a story that's been repeated so much without pushback?
Yeah, her studies, I mean, were an influence when I was writing the article, but not before. It really started with that article in Ibn Manthur's dictionary, and that got me thinking. But definitely, I while I was studying the topic and writing the article, I was asking colleagues in the field of late antiquity, writ large, what should I read about this topic of infanticide in the Greco-Roman world, or in antiquity or late antiquity? And Scott's work was something that was recommended to me, and I definitely found her articles interesting, and especially the ideas, because in the Greco-Roman world, or the scholarship on it, the idea has quite commonly been that there as well there was especially female infanticide was something that was going on quite often, and also the people who uh, had some sort of de defects when they were born, where more often they face this horrible fate of infanticide. But she goes through the archaeological evidence on the topic, and some literary evidence, and says that this is not necessarily the case. And of course, yeah, there were definitely parallels to what I was trying to show in the 2 articles. But it was really only when I was writing the article that I got to read her work.
So it sounds like based on her work, the idea of infanticide in antiquity did happen, but it was exaggerated in the literary sources, and the material evidence really doesn't back up, what the findings are.
Yeah, that's her take basically, and of course, it's not my field, so I cannot really comment on this, but it seems something that we can also see in other fields, like I argue in Islamic studies as well, where it's this notion of female infanticide is very common in popular discourse today, and it's quite common also in scholarly discourse. But then when we go to actually the classical Arabic sources and see what they say, there's quite a lot of variety there. They also mention, male infanticide as being quite common, so it's not only female infanticide, and that there's quite a lot of classical Arabic texts that actually say that there were these many figures that actually forbid the practice. So Abdul Muttalib, the grandfather of the Prophet Muhammad, for instance, is mentioned as one of those figures who said that enough, this shouldn't be happening.
And
So
if I could add, I
yeah.
remember in within the Islamic tradition that there was one figure who would stop certain people from committing female infanticide by taking the children in themselves. I really didn't have time to look into it to see what the exact narration was about, but I do remember it. And then it got me thinking about how you cited one book in your article where foundlings were something that existed. Foundlings meaning people that or children that were abandoned and then found by other people. So I was just trying to put two and two together to see if maybe that in the Islamic tradition there is some kind of remnants of such a practice, but that there were certain mechanisms to kind of or it wasn't as brutal as what the tradition, some
Mhm.
aspects of the tradition describe, if that makes sense. Sorry, it's kind of off the cuff kind of question, but
No. That makes perfect sense, and there's quite a lot of variety how the classical Arabic texts describe pre-Islamic Arabia, and I mean there are texts that say that it was very common practice, and it was in particular female infanticide. Then there are others who say that no, it wasn't actually taking place much at all, or maybe it was also male infanticide to some extent. So there's actually quite a lot of diversity in the views in classical Arabic sources, although it's quite clear that it is especially um, female infanticide mentioned by most sources, and maybe we can say that uh, uh, the majority of the classical Arabic scholars who actually discussed this matter said that it was quite common practice in pre-Islamic Arabia, but that's not sort of the only story that exists in the books.
In terms of focusing on the Quran, going back to the Quran for a second, in your view, is the Quran's own criticism of infanticide in intertextual conversation with prior Jewish and Christian tradition on the subject, and to what extent does the Quran's discourse about it differ from previous religious theological texts?
Yeah, I mean, it seems that there are a couple of instances where we can say that there are clear linkages to earlier scriptures or earlier sort of uh, Judeo-Christian discourses on infanticide, where infanticide is linked to the idea of idol worship. So that's something that the pagans do, and it's somehow linked perhaps to idolatry. And we should be very clear that when going further in this discussion, I sort of question or problematize the notion that female infanticide is mentioned at least clearly in the Quran. I think we should be very clear in saying that infanticide and basically its rejection and outlawing, or whatever you want to call it, is mentioned in the Quran. It's quite clear that in four cases at least, the Quran is talking about killing children, killing infants, qatlul awlad. In Arabic, there's no ambiguity about that topic. And the Quran takes a very clear stance that this is something that should not be going on at all, even if, and then the Quran actually gives quite interesting sort of, perhaps we could say, social historical context in saying, at least if I remember correctly, in 2 instances where it is said that, even if, there's poverty and famine might be something that is the context where the infanticide is taking place, still you shouldn't kill your infants. Trust in God, believe in God. God will provide. That's the message. And there and of course that probably means that as in the Greco-Roman world, infanticide was something that was practiced by especially people who were desperate and in need, and it probably also mean that the Quranic message and the mission of the Prophet Muhammad had an effect of some kind, at least in stamping out the practice. So that, I think, is quite clear from the Quran, even though of course we cannot always say that if the Quran is ascribing to the pagans or its opponents something that was always something that was taking place. There might be some sort of polemical instances in the Quran where a notion or a narrative is used for polemical effect against the opponents. But on the basis of the Quranic passages on infanticide, I think it's quite clear that at least some pre-Islamic Arabians committed infanticide, and the Quran clearly rejects, forbids such a practice, and probably had a positive effect to some extent, at least among Arabians.
So we do have evidence that in maybe both the Judeo-Christian context and an Islamic context, that the rise of monotheism in these regions did actually impact the practice of infanticide in a positive way?
Well, that's what the scholars of early Christianity say, that even though it's exaggerated in 2 senses, so the so-called pagans were not so often committing infanticide to begin with, and second, of course, also some Christians, some Jews, and some Muslims also carried out either infanticide or infant abandonment. Teron mentioned the scholarly discourses in fiqh books on foundlings, and that's something that you see in the fiqh or Islamic jurisprudence books. So they are discussing this phenomenon. If you find an abandoned baby or child, what happens then? Is that child considered a slave of yours? That was a minority opinion that was then discarded by or rejected by most schools or all schools of fiqh. But that was something that was voiced by some Muslim scholars, and that's actually the Greco-Roman practice, if I'm not mistaken. So the foundlings were raised as slaves mostly. So yeah.
So the crux of this conversation is that you're challenging certain Quranic verses that are believed to espouse this concept of waḥd al-banāt. Why do you believe that the traditional interpretation of these verses associated with female infanticide should be challenged?
Yeah. I mean, there are a few reasons. First of all, the Quranic passages where this appears, so 2 occurrences only in the Quran. in very, I claim at least, ambiguous passages that can and maybe should be understood in a different way. So Surat al-Nahl, that's the 16th surah, and Surat al-Takwir, that's the 81st surah of the Quran, is where this is conventionally thought to be evidenced in the Quran, namely female infanticide. But then when we consider other types of evidence, so take inscriptions, for instance, they never, as far as I know, mention female infanticide. Pre-Islamic poetry, and we can discuss that further, probably doesn't evidence such a habit. Then we have non-Arabic sources as well, and there are a few mentions of maybe infanticide, but in one case, for instance, we have and I believe this was a Greek source, where the inhabitants of Duma, that's in the northern Hijaz, in the northern Arabia, Dumatul Jandal nowadays, where it said that the inhabitants of Duma they killed a boy in some ritual fashion or as part of some ritual. So once again, we don't seem to have female infanticide there. And then when we critically analyze the stories that are contained in classical Arabic sources about the supposed waʻd al-banāt, or female infanticide, and especially by burying them alive, that also raises quite a lot of questions. We don't have a lot of concrete information in these sources about who was actually carrying out such a barbarous deed. It's quite often ascribed to the tribe of Tamim, and it seems that these ascriptions of waʻd al-banāt to Tamim might be part of Islamic-era polemics against that tribe. So that's my reading of the evidence, at least. So if this was a supposedly common or somewhat common cultural practice, you would think that it would have left more traces in the evidence, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So that's my have been the main sort of motivation to calling into question this.
Yeah, reading your forthcoming article, it just only reaffirmed that Tamim throughout Islamic history tends to be the butt of a lot of polemics, unfortunately. Even though, in my opinion, they've had like some very interesting movements, figures, and tribes come out of that text. So why, in your view, have modern researchers, with all of the criticism and critical inquiry into Islamic history, have mostly followed in the path of pre-modern exegetes and believing that the Quran is discussing female infanticide in particular, and that this was an accurate reflection on how commonly it was practiced by pre-Islamic Arabian communities? Just from my recollection, I know you do mention some other people, modern and classical, that somewhat not problematize it to the extent that you're doing, but definitely kind of call into question, re-looking at these verses. But how come no one has taken it as far as you have, in your opinion?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think to many people this has been sort of like a minor topic that hasn't. I mean, there hasn't been so much scholarship on the topic to begin with, so that's I think the main reason. And of course, I mean, it's only recently that we can say that we have quite a lot of a quite good corpus of epigraphic record, for instance, of pre-Islamic Arabian inscriptions. So maybe that's one of the reasons. But yeah, it's a little bit puzzling to me as well. I mean, there has definitely been people who have somewhat called into the question the two verses and their understanding. I mean, their conventional understanding, but yeah, it's mostly still being accepted as something that was taking place. But yeah, I have no good answer to that. But it seems to have been just something. It's a convention that people have been repeating, a conventional notion that people have been repeating.
The alternative readings that have happened, that have sort of offered interpretations that maybe veer away from the commonly held traditional view, how substantial were those alternative readings? Were they very marginal? Were they serious in the way that they challenged a dominant interpretation, or would you say that your article is particularly innovative in that respect? And why do you think the mainstream narrative has prevailed for so long?
Yeah. I'm not sure if it's innovative, but I mean, it's certainly quite different in the sense that I also, and which has also been somewhat puzzling to me. Why hasn't there been more sort of linguistic or philological work on the word wada, which I analyzed to a certain extent, and like I mentioned, the primary meaning of the word seems to be emit a loud voice or sound, and especially tread on the ground and thus emit a loud voice. So that has for some reason been overlooked, and there I think maybe the innovative aspect lies, if there is such in the article or articles. I mean, there have been other scholars such as Champika Mika Paraskeva, who has she's a Greek scholar. She has really analyzed in a Spanish language article in a very in-depth manner these narratives about waḥd al-banāt and especially its ascription to the tribe Tamim. So that has definitely taken place, but yeah, I think in a way that my articles systematically try to look at various different source sets and then try to reconstruct or suggest some analysis on the basis of that. So maybe that's where the innovative aspect is, if there is such.
Okay, so we know that the notion of pre-Islamic Arabians practicing waḥd al-banāt comes to us primarily through Islamic-era sources, composed much later than the events they claim to describe. Given that distance in time, there's always the risk that these accounts reflect the agendas and rhetorical needs of their own period more than actual pre-Islamic practice. With that in mind, what historical evidence outside of the Quran do you believe best supports your interpretation? And how do you assess the reliability of these Islamic sources in reconstructing pre-Islamic history?
Yeah, that's a great question and a pretty big one. I mean, to some extent, of course, my argument of the non-existence, to some extent at least, of female infanticide is an argument from silence, namely that even if we look at tens of thousands of pre-Islamic Arabian inscriptions and tens of thousands of verses of pre-Islamic Arabic poetry, we don't encounter any mentions of such a habit. So that's sort of something that should be acknowledged, and arguments from silence can be countered, and if new evidence arises, then of course I might take my words back. I might have to take my words back. But it's the why I'm willing to risk doing such a claim from silence also rests on the notion that the Greco-Roman writers were pretty keen on describing infanticide and infant abandonment and its various aspects. So at least in this cultural context, which might be different, of course, at least in the Greco-Roman cultural context, it wasn't considered sort of like a taboo subject or anything such like to describe this. So one would think that in the tens of thousands of Arabic verse that survives from pre-Islamic era, you would have some sort of at least references to it, but we basically only have one verse which is ascribed, which survives in various forms and is ascribed to Hassan ibn Thabit, the famous figure and poet from Medina, and then another poet or let's say tribal leader, and it's a sort of like a single verse which is adduced by especially the Mufassirun or the Quranic exegetes, and they only mention that verse. It doesn't seem to belong to any longer poem of Hassan or the other figure. So if you go to the critical edition of Hassan ibn Thabit's poetry done by Walid Arafat in the 1950s, if I remember correctly, there, he only gives the single verse. It doesn't appear in any manuscripts of Hassan's poetry collection. It only appears in sort of later sources quoting the verse and ascribing it to Hassan or another figure. And so that's the only supposedly pre-Islamic, or at least early Islamic. We have to remember that Hassan, of course, lived to see the caliphate of the Rashidun, or the first four caliphs. It might be an Islamic era verse if it were authentic, but to me, the fact that it only survives in this very sort of atomic fashion, only this verse, and it's not connected to any other poem, it raises questions, and I think we can, with certain with some certainty, we can say that it might be in authentic verse. But so taking all of this together, I think, and especially the Quranic passages as well, which I said are ambiguous, we can question the existence of waʿd al-banāt.
In focusing on the argument you make specifically in Surah Al-Nahl, the 16th surah, you discuss how an expression there which classical exegetes have often understood as burying the infant in the ground, you take issue with that interpretation, suggesting it doesn't necessarily mean literal burial, and instead you draw a distinction between infant exposure and infanticide, arguing that the former didn't necessarily mean the death of the child. But wouldn't death have been the most common consequence of abandoning an infant daughter or son somewhere in the desert? Is there really a meaningful difference between that and the practice of infanticide?
Yeah, good question. And yeah, so my argument is that verse or group of verses in Surah An-Nahl that mention that there's this passage where there's sort of like a hypothetical, we might say, or literary disbeliever or a pagan who thinks about either killing his infant daughter or then abandoning her. And the expression there is yadussuhu fit turab. And I mean, it's quite clear that infant abandonment quite often, probably in the majority of the cases, resulted in the baby's death. However, that's not necessarily the point that I'm making. And because this verse, the Surah An-Nahl, and those verses are quite often adduced as evidence, but both by classical scholars and then modern researchers, as this phenomenon of female infanticide by burying her alive. So, and I think it's quite unclear if the Quran says that. I mean, it might be understood in many ways, but I suggest that infant abandonment might be something that is going on there. And once again, that's something that, first of all, is ascribed to a sort of like a hypothetical pagan. And then he's actually thinking about it. The verses don't actually say that he carries out that deed or crime. And there were some classical scholars as well, such as I think al-Mawardi from the 11th century Common Era, who in his exegesis mentions that this might mean abandonment instead of burying alive. So it's quite unclear how to understand that. It can be understood in various ways, but I would argue that the verse cannot be at least explicitly understood to mean female infanticide by burying the daughter alive. That's not how you can translate that phrase.
Then how would you translate Yadusahu fil Tarab?
Yeah, so dasa is a very common verb in Arabic, which means to do something secretly, to place something secretly somewhere. It's this, clandestine fashion is what it sort of invokes, that verb. So I would say places it or her, namely the child, the female child, daughter, secretly, and then we have fit turab, and that has been often understood as in the ground, inside the ground, under the ground. But as I discussed there in the article, it quite often means just on the ground as well. So not necessarily inside the ground, but on the ground. So it could very easily be understood, and that I argue as my suggestion. And actually, I was very happy to note that al-Mawardi and some other scholars said that this is a possible understanding of the verse. So place her, namely the child, secretly on the dust, on the ground.
Which in Arabic, would that be like some kind of idiom, or is that like a kind of an expression to leave on the dust, meaning abandon? Or, I mean, it's a very convincing argument that you make here, in my opinion. But I was just curious if like that's some kind of expression used by Arabs to mean to abandon, to leave in the dust.
No, I mean, it can mean various things. I don't think it occurs as an idiom as such, but fit turab can mean many things. Leave on the ground, inside the ground, various things. But it doesn't unambiguously mean bury inside the ground. That's what I'm claiming, at least. Yeah.
Okay. So going back to your interpretation of Surat al-Takwir, in your article, you also challenged the classical exegetical reading of al-Ma'uda. Please forgive me of my pronunciation. in Surah Al-Taqwir, as I just mentioned, which is chapter 81, verse 8. As the daughter is buried alive, you note that the root waḥd doesn't occur in other Semitic languages and has other meanings in the Arabic lexica, and that pre-Islamic poetic corpus that aren't tied, I mean, and in the pre-Islamic poetic corpus that aren't tied to burial as such. Now, you've argued that certain poetic lines containing al-ma'uda, as you just mentioned before our last question, are likely Islamic era forgeries, partly because the term is otherwise unattested in pre-Islamic poetry. The verses survive only in isolated lines, as you mentioned, and they're so similar that one seems modeled on the other.
Mm.
But couldn't these features also be explained by the fragmentary nature of the surviving poetic corpus, and that the formulaic tendencies in early Arabic and the formulaic tendencies in early Arabic verses? How confident can we be that these factors point to deliberate fabrication rather than natural transmission losses or poetic reuse?
Yeah, yeah, good question. I think it's quite possible that, there might arise evidence at some point that counters or calls into question my interpretation, but um, I mean, we still have a quite vast corpus of pre-Islamic poetry or
Mm,
poetry that is ascribed to pre-Islamic figures. So, um, given that, it would be somewhat surprising if something completely new, is found somewhere. And I forgot to mention earlier that the verb wa'ada actually appears in two verses that are ascribed to Umayyah ibn Abi Salt,
mm,
one pre-Islamic figure. He was some sort of monotheist. He's quite often called a Hanif in uh, the classical Arabic sources, meaning a monotheist who was neither Jew nor Christian. But there have been some claims by modern scholars saying that he might have been a Christian, for instance, but we don't have clear evidence uh, for his sort of religious identity. And it should be mentioned, by the way, that a lot of forgeries were ascribed to Umayyah ibn Abi Salt. So we cannot be certain that these two instances of wa'ada ascribed to Umayyah are authentically pre-Islamic occurrences of that verb.
mm,
But in any case, they might be early Islamic. And in those two instances, it's quite clear that it cannot mean uh, bury someone alive. Rather, I suggest there that the meaning of treading or uh, being tread underfoot or being downtrodden might obtain in those instances. Other scholars have suggested that these two verses only, or the verb in those two verses only means to bury, which is also interesting in if actually in pre-Islamic times the verb wa'ada meant just to bury, not to bury alive, and didn't have sort of any gendered connotations, that verb. But I sort of incline towards the idea that probably the meaning of treading is the one that is sort of the prevalent there, and all of those instances, including the Quranic ones in Surah Al-Takwir, verse 81, or Surah 81, verse 8, uh, could be understood as being trodden underfoot, the word al-maw'uda.
This might sound like an odd question, but the idea that this verse is actually talking about a girl or a woman that has been trampled to death.
Yeah.
I mean, would that have been a common cause of death for anyone in that period? I mean, is that something that happened, that the Quran would mention it?
I mean, the passage is eschatological. So Surah Takwir is the beginning of it is eschatological. So it's one of these Ida passages. So when something happens, then that is the last day. So, and it goes through various odd occurrences. And this seems to be one of those sort of odd occurrences that then foretell that this is the end days, this is the last days. So in that context, if you understand that as an eschatological passage, which it is quite clearly, the other ones are about sort of rare occurrences that make people wonder, then you know, it's quite possible that trampled underfoot women who, you know, is being asked for which crime was she killed. That's sort of like an eschatological occurrence or event that is among the other eschatological events mentioned in Surah Al-Takwir, and that's a Meccan surah, and these sort of Ida passages when there are various these Ida sort of occurrences in these sort of passages, and then these passages end with the Quran declaring that then, for instance, you shall know that, you know, this is the Yawmuddin, the judgment day.
So in your reading, then this would be part of almost the chaos that precedes Judgment Day.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's correct.
Now, I do want to mention one thing, and it's not on the script, and you explained it in your article, and it really broke my heart because I would use this as evidence for waḥd al-banāt in pre-Islamic Arabia. But there is an inscription found in the southern portion of Arabia, dating from quite a while before the advent of Islam. I saw in an interview with Robert Hoyland, where he had mentioned, like, yeah, there's no evidence, no material evidence for such a practice in pre-Islamic Arabia. And to my mind, I remember reading an article by Christian Robban, where he kind of mentions the inscription I just mentioned, saying that it reads similar to what was going on in pre-Islamic Arabia with female infanticide. But you don't see that as evidence for such a practice in pre-Islamic Arabia. Can you explain why that is the case, in your opinion? This is something I'm curious about because I use it. I use it as evidence. Even at the ICSA conference, when it was brought up, I pulled Roxana aside and pulled out my laptop, like, "Hey, we have this inscription right here," and then to read that, you know, it's not considered acceptable evidence for what we're discussing.
Yeah. I mean, it should be mentioned that Sabek is definitely something that is in the core of my expertise, or Sabek inscriptions, even though I've read quite a lot and used them quite a lot. So this is the inscription Mafra Qutra 1. That's the siglum of the inscription, and it is found near Sana'a, the modern and medieval town of Sana'a. And according to the experts of Sabek inscriptions and epigraphy, it's a very ancient inscription. So
In the second century BC.
yeah, something like that. So I mean, it cannot, for a historian, I would say it cannot have sort of like a direct relevance to understand the rise of Islam. So that's the first point I would make. The second point is that it's only in light of the received notion of waḥd al-banāt and the received notion that the Quranic word al-maw'uda means or must mean an infant daughter buried alive, that this inscription has been sort of understood to refer to the same practice, but it doesn't really. I mean, it mentions the daughters or the girls of this town, Matirat, and that they should not be killed. And this is preceded by the notion that the girls, the daughters of the city of Matirat, should not be given in marriage to anyone outside the city, nor is it allowed to kill any girls, any of its girls. So I think it's quite unlikely that this refers to female infanticide. I mean, it proceeds with the notion that, you know, some sort of endogamy within the city should be practiced, and seems to discuss girls that were of or women that were of marrying age, whatever that might have been in antiquity in that region. So relating it to female infanticide seems like a stretch. It just seems to be one of the regulations in that inscriptions that are mentioned in relation to the women of the city. The message being quite positive that you shouldn't there shouldn't be any violence, or at least killing, the ultimate violence of the women of that city. So it's only I think in light of the received notion of female infanticide, which supposedly was happening in pre-Islamic Arabia quite commonly, that this is then connected to that idea. But it's quite unlikely. I mean, and also the chronological gap. And also, by the way, and this is something that I was thinking 10 years ago, if this was a common cultural practice, female infanticide that is, and routinely women were killed, or female infants were killed, and we would have evidence for that in going back centuries in pre-Islamic Arabia. That would mean that the male to female ratio would be really skewed. And as far as I know, we don't have any evidence for that in the sort of biographical dictionaries that we have that go back to the pre-Islamic era as well, and which people think that are quite reliable evidence, by the way, of also pre-Islamic Arabia, even though they were compiled in Islamic times. So that's also something to consider. And if it was a very common cultural practice, and you know, going back centuries, then that would mean that there probably would not have been any Arabians left by the Prophet Muhammad's time.
Stepping back for a moment from the specifics of the Quranic verses, the later historical accounts, and the poetry, how far do you think your thesis about female infanticide fits into the broader trends that we're witnessing in Islamic studies that sees the rise of Islam as less of a sharp rupture in Arabian religious beliefs and ethical views? And is there a parallel or an analog in the way biblical studies now tends to approach the rise of Christianity?
Yeah, I think there's a parallel, and I've been definitely, you know, influenced a lot by people studying the history of Jesus, for instance, or you know, the rise of Christianity, where it's quite often understood nowadays that the early Christians were a movement that came from among Judaism, and you know, there was a long period when Christian identity was being formatted, and then you know, ultimately labeled as something called Christianity. So yeah, definitely I've been influenced by those notions, and I think in the case of Islamic origins, it's definitely a viewpoint that I have, that the rise of Islam was not a, full-blown revolution, but it's the Prophet Muhammad's mission is about gradual reform. Like I mentioned, I think the Quran quite clearly does mention and does prohibit infanticide in general, and probably had a positive effect in limiting or the practice. But probably it wasn't widespread. And one of the reasons it wasn't widespread was probably that because many Arabians, even in the 5th and 6th centuries, were actually Jews and Christians whose scriptures also forbade the practice. And, if they were following sort of the legal and ethical notions of their religions, they were not so much practicing such a habit. So that also is somehow, I would say, related to this notion of infanticide and how much there was of it, namely to what extent the rise of Islam brings about full-blown monotheistic revolution. And as we've talked on this very channel, I don't think that's necessarily the case. There were quite a lot, if not the majority, of Arabians who were already monotheists of sorts. So and I also think that many of them were Jews and Christians, or Jews or Christians, and that also has to be taken into account. That being said, there were probably quite a lot of people who were so-called pagans still, so neither Jews nor Christians, and maybe, even though I wouldn't be willing to go too far with this, maybe infanticide, maybe even female infanticide, was more common among them, and then the Quranic sort of gradual reform, which sort of continues the monotheistic trajectories of Judaism and Christianity in Arabia, and the ethical thinking that often went along with those sort of currents. Then the Quran continues with the same message that every human being is valued, and infanticide shouldn't be committed even in need.
So in that view, sort of the Quran is just engaging in a reinforcement of an existing monotheistic ethics, rather than bringing a prohibition that previously was not common, if that makes sense.
To a large degree. And of course, I mean, we don't know quite clearly yet how big of a percentage, for instance, of the people on the eve of Islam in Arabia in general, or in the Hijaz in particular, were so-called pagans. But of course, that is something that future epigraphic finds or other finds will probably help shed light on.
And pagan is such a loaded term. In my mind, maybe it's not the right description to use. I try to say biblical monotheists. That way it leaves open the fact that they may have had certain heretical views in terms of how many monotheistic traditions would like to understand what monotheism is about.
Yeah.
So, how would you respond to those who might argue that work coming out of the field of Quranic studies, including your own, that takes issue with longstanding traditional interpretations are too speculative and excessively revisionist?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. Um, I think what I try to foreground in my scholarship is tangible evidence, contemporary evidence such as inscriptions, and using them as building blocks to reconstruct historical currents. And uh, so, in that sense, I think the amount of speculation might be might be smaller, and I think uh, the the field has changed since the 1970s or so, when revisionism really started with the work of Michael Cook and Patricia Crone and John Wansbrough. I mean, their work in the 1970s, though influential, can be said to be, with hindsight at least, very speculative and not really based on sort of tangible evidence that many scholars in Quranic studies use nowadays. That is to say, manuscripts that we can actually date, inscriptions that we can date to a certain extent, at least papyri, that sort of material evidence that we have from Arabian Peninsula and regions near it.
And I
So,
imagine the poetic corpus was seen differently back then as well.
right,
It
yeah.
seems like the discourse around pre-Islamic or early Arabic poetry has definitely shifted.
Yeah. That is certainly the case. So it wasn't valued as evidence at all for in the revisionist scholarship. It was thought to be a forgery. Of course, the idea of forged pre-Islamic poetry is actually something that goes back to the 1920s. So it's a very early sort of revisionist idea by David Margoliouth and Taha Hussain in the 1920s argued for this. Um, uh, but yeah, and the revisionist scholarship did not really use much poetry. It's only in the 21st century that it has become somewhat, uh, not a consensus, but a semi-consensus that the pre-Islamic poetry is to some extent, and in my opinion, to a large extent, actually authentic and goes back to pre-Islamic figures, even though it might have changed because it was transmitted in a sort of oral, both in an oral and somewhat written environment for 200 years or so, when it was then written down in more authoritative poetry collections. I mean, and one thing that has been interesting in Quranic studies has been these recent calls to decolonize Quranic studies by, for instance, Joseph Lambert and Mohammed Salama wrote a book last year, or came out last year, and they both call for using indigenous sources in Quranic studies and studies of early Islam more generally. And I really agree with that basic notion. What I disagree with is how they view what is indigenous. For Lambert, it seems to me that the uh, the Arabic exegetical tradition is the indigenous sort of evidence that we should use in understanding the Quran. For Muhammad Salama is somewhat more broadly sort of Arabic literature, which includes pre-Islamic Arabic literature, and there I definitely agree, especially if it is a poetry that comes from Arabian Peninsula and not, say, Iraq or you know some city in Syria. Uh, but in Lambert's case, I mean, the exegetical traditions, for the vast majority of them, they do not come from Arabian Peninsula. Rather, what I see as real indigenous evidence is these inscriptions that are still there in Arabia, and especially when we discuss pre-Islamic era, uh, for which we don't have sort of contemporary literary texts, at least in Arabic, with the exception of pre-Islamic poetry. So there, I think really foregrounding the inscriptional evidence is key. I also hope that archaeology, which is definitely picking up speed in Saudi Arabia and in other Arabian countries, is something that will, show more evidence that can be helpful in reconstructing the rise of Islam, reconstructing what life was about in pre-Islamic Arabia. It's a rising field as well, but at the moment, at least, it's the epigraphic evidence that seems to hold more value.
And I think it's important for people who read Lombard's work and might get confused as to what an indigenous source means, that it's very different from historical critical perspective, which, like you said, is focusing on what it deems indigenous sources are sources that are contemporaneous to the Quran, that are within that geographical context, within that very specific era that precedes in the Quran and occurs contemporaneously with it as well.
Yeah.
Whereas Lombard is viewing things that are much later, sources that are much later from the classical tradition as an indigenous source, whereas from a historical critical perspective, that would be more reception history of the Quran, rather than an actual indigenous source.
Yeah.
And I think unless and I think when approaching Lombard's work, people should realize that they're defined differently depending on your perspective.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
In your research, including on this subject, you employ social identity theory as an interpretive framework. Why did you find it useful when addressing this topic in particular? And do you believe it also has a wider application in the field of religious studies more generally?
Yeah, I mean, I found social identity theory over 10 years ago when I found out that many people in biblical studies had been using it to understand sort of various biblical texts or, non-canonical texts. And so it's a theory or field of theorization from social psychologists. This specific field started in 1960s, 1970s by the work of Henry Tajfel in particular, and his students and his students' students. So, and it's still considered valid in social psychology, even though there have been more people that have contributed to it. And basically the idea is that in social identity theory, scholars look at what categorization, quite often self-categorization, and I especially mean social categorization, does in human relations. How does it affect how we see ourselves and how we see the others? And it has been quite universally shown by social psychological studies on the topic that first of all, people identify the groups. That's something that people do quite automatically. It's also part of the wholesale categorization of phenomena in the world. We cannot really go without doing that. And similarly, as we categorize different flowers in a different ways, we also categorize people and ourselves in various groups or social categories. And in-group favoritism, that is to say that you view the social category that you identify with more highly than the outgroup or outgroups, that in-group favoritism has been shown to be quite universally true. Then the other side of the coin, outgroup stereotyping or sort of pejorative attitudes toward the outgroup, is something that is not universal but quite common. And in certain settings, especially when there's some sort of social competition, which can be understood in various ways, some sort of social competition going on, these outgroup sort of negative descriptions or understandings of the outgroup also prevails almost universally in those settings. So that has been interesting I think in biblical studies, because it has given quite fine-grained understandings of how various biblical texts categorize different groups and what is perhaps the reason for that categorization, but what is the effect of that categorization, and especially the idea that in-group favoritism is so common and also out-group stereotyping to a certain extent at least has sort of opened new avenues in biblical studies, and also the understanding of how, for instance, Jews are very negatively described in certain New Testament books, even though Christianity or early Christianity is a movement that arises within Judaism, but still you have those a few passages where Jews or Judaism is very negatively described. Those can be understood as some sort of social competition that was going on, or that the writer had a very salient in-group identity. So these have been suggestions by biblical studies scholars using the social identity approach to these texts. And what is very important in social identity theory is to look at these categorizations and what they do and how they change, because in social identity theory, these social categories and with it identity more generally, including self-identity, is understood to be always sort of in flux and in a very dynamic mode. So looking at how people are categorized and what sort of adjectives and attributes are ascribed to these categories is important from the point of view of social identity theory, if that makes any sense. And when it comes to waʿd al-banāt, I think what is interesting there is that sometimes it is the whole pre-Islamic Arabs as a group that is ascribed the practice or crime of female infanticide. Sometimes it's a specific tribe, and some lexicographers mention that it was the tribe of Kinda that was particularly doing this, but they don't ever identify any individual from Kinda, so that seems quite weird in any case. But most often it's the tribe Tamim that it's the butt of these claims, and the tribal leader who is called Qais ibn Asim, and he is in these narratives sort of the main culprit of carrying out female infanticide. There's a hadith to the effect where he says that he killed 8 infant daughters of his. And in other narratives as well, he is sort of mentioned as the main culprit the main perpetrator of this crime. And which is, by the way, interesting that there are these sort of singular mentions of individuals who actually practice this crime, if, as some sources claim, and many modern sources echo, this was a very common cultural practice. You would think that they would then name, other people as well, Abu Lahab, some of the famous opponents of the Prophet Muhammad, for instance, who are not, as far as I know, mentioned as perpetrating female infanticide. You would think that if that was a common cultural occurrence. And what I suggest in the second article, which is still forthcoming, is that it was the social competition in early Islamic era which led to people, and then some scholars claim that it was in particular the tribe Tamim that was doing this or had been doing this. So Tamim, there were numerous reasons or possible reasons which we can think of why they were sort of the butt of the attacks. Here, they sided with the, or many of them, it's a huge tribal confederation from Najd in Central Arabia. So a lot of variety there, of course. But during the second fitna, they sided with the so-called anti-caliph in the Hijaz, Abdullah ibn Zubair, and then they are heavily sort of censured for that in poetry, for instance, and in prose as well, and there are other reasons as well why they might have been so hated by the non-Tamimis.
I want to say they sided against Abu Bakr in the war of apostasy. They did. Maybe Roxana could correct me. My memory's a little bit fuzzy on this, but that they sided with one of the prophetess, or I don't know. Maybe I'm confused, but I thought that one of the reasons, as well as what you mentioned, that they sided with the anti-caliph, but that in the wars of apostasy against Abu Bakr, they also sided with the opposite side in that as well.
Yeah. I have to recheck that and add to the article. Good point. Yeah, the various reasons seem to, but it seems that it was in particular during the second fitna when we see the first evidences of, in poetry, that is, in Arabic poetry, of the idea that waʿd al-banāt was something that was going on. And actually the first, datable occurrence that we can find, or I could find at least, is in the poetry of al-Farazdaq. And this is a Tamimi poet. What he says, he died in 729, if I remember correctly, Common Era. And what he says that actually, us Tamimis, we don't do this. It was my uncle who actually forbade this practice and saved numerous, infants who were to be buried alive. So he seems to be reacting to something. There are some missing links in my sort of thesis how this, or hypothesis how this came about, but it seems that Tamim started to be sort of ascribed this habit maybe quite soon after the second fitna, when there was quite a lot of polemics against this tribe, and then al-Farazdaq is only sort of reacting to it. Because then in later evidence, which we cannot date so clearly, there are these narratives which, they quite clearly attribute the crime of waʿd al-banāt to Tamim, and they say things like, I think this is from at-Tabari, he says that Arabs were very keen on committing this crime, but actually it was the Tamim who started it, and then the habit spread to the
Other tribe.
other tribes. And we cannot really date that, but that's my hypothesis, that it's something that started in the second fitna or in the aftermath of the second fitna, and then Al-Farazdaq's reaction to this sort of anti-Tamimi discourse is the first sort of datable piece of evidence that we can find.
Mhm. You also take issue with the term pre-Islamic Arabs, and so why is the term pre-Islamic Arabs a problematic term? And is there a way of getting around this when trying to unpick how the pre-Islamic period was constructed in later texts? I kind of have an idea on why you see it to be problematic after reading Peter Webb's work on the subject. I know maybe some other academics might believe, especially in the first part of his book, he went a little too far in
Mm.
problematizing Arab identity. But I kind of get where you're going with it. But is there a way of kind of getting around speak even in your article you mentioned that just for argument's sake, I'm gonna use pre-Islamic Arabs to describe what I'm talking about. Is there any way of getting around that? Do you see any scholarship being more specific in who they're addressing
Mm.
instead of using this catch-all term pre-Islamic Arabs? As we know, the Yemenis up to a certain point didn't identify as Arabs. You can say that Arab identity wasn't the highest identity on the totem pole for
Yeah.
many other, especially Central Arabian tribes. And so, do you see any way of getting around this when
Mm.
explaining the features of pre-Islamic Arabia in terms of its inhabitants?
Yeah, you very well, put what is the issue here. So Arabia is it's a huge landmass. So there's a lot of has been and is a lot of cultural diversity there. And many people did not identify as Arab in pre-Islamic Arabia. That seems to be the case, especially if you will look at Sabek inscriptions in the south. They always talk of that the Arabs are some people who live somewhat to the
Frontier.
north, or a lot to the north of this Himyari kingdom, for instance. So, and Michael McDonald, who studied in an article published some years ago, maybe in 2009, if memory serves me right, studied self-identifications as Arab in pre-Islamic materials. He pointed out that most of these self-identifications as an Arab are actually in Greek or other languages rather than Arabic. So
It tend to be outside of the Arabian Peninsula as well,
yeah,
if I remember
yeah, they
correctly.
survive in at least in these attestations. So it seems that not everybody who spoke Arabic as their first language saw themselves as Arabs. And on the other hand, there were people who were living in Arabia and thus identified as an Arab, but they did not speak Arabic as their first language. So it was sort of, and different centuries seem to have witnessed different ways of using this, moniker Arab, either as self-identity or then as sort of like a exonym, that is sort of outgroup uh, appellation or term. Um, but yeah, I don't know how to go about it. I mean, just use more geographical specificity if you can, and talk about people in Medina, for instance, or people in Mecca, or then refer to the languages that were used. It's quite clear that Arabic was on the eve of Islam. Arabic was, especially in the Hijaz, that was the main language. It was not the only language, and especially if you go south of Hijaz, or southern Hijaz, and then south of Hijaz, there were South Arabian languages that were spoken and written. And of course, you have, a few individuals using Greek, Hebrew, etc. So quite a lot of diversity there, and that's a difficult um, question. When you write, you sometimes need to resort to these shorthands to be somewhat concise. and not always use quite long descriptions of the people who you are describing.
Yeah, I was trying to explain that to somebody else when I was using the term monotheism to explain what most of the inhabitants of Arabia were uh, before the rise of Islam. And I know some people, again, like pagan, monotheism is a loaded term, but when you're trying to explain it to people who aren't so familiar with this kind of discourse, you kind of have to sacrifice a bit of nuance. So yeah, I totally get where you're coming from. I just find the whole topic of Arab identity pre-Islam, especially going into early Islam, to be such a fascinating topic. And I still kind of don't know what exactly it meant to be an Arab pre-Islam and how it transitioned from what it was into like the prima facie identity of
Yeah.
the whole peninsula. So yeah, thank
In terms of thinking about the more conflicted relationship that Arabs had with their identity, how does the discussion of female infanticide in later classical Islamic scholarship become part of a part of this larger conflicted relationship that Arabs developed with their sort of imagined pre-Islamic past, where they took pride in that past, but at the same time sort of denigrated that past.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a very conflicted description that you find in the sources, definitely, and a conflicting one as well. So, I mean, quite often in classical Arabic sources you encounter the idea that the best poets and best warriors lived in pre-Islamic Arabia, and then on the other hand there are these very negative depictions of pre-Islamic Arabia, and and the whole thing that they are always, or quite commonly at least, uh, sort of discussing pre-Islamic Arabia always in a very uh, sort of a fashion that, in a monolithic fashion, one might say. So it's always the Jahiliyyah, the people of Jahiliyyah, the Arabs of Jahiliyyah, uh, whereas we know with the help of material evidence and epigraphic evidence that there was a lot of variety in this, in these various communities that existed in Arabia. So that alone shows that the classical Arabic authors, when they were describing pre-Islamic Arabia, were quite often construing something rather than uh, sort of describing something that they had empirical evidence of. And they were using the image of Jahiliyyah quite often to argue for something. So within poetry, for instance, there was this huge debate in the Abbasid era if the sort of the new poets, the muhdathun, the newer poets, are better than the pre-Islamic poets, and which styles should one follow, and there also the idea of, or the notion of, or the image of Jahiliyyah was often invoked for or against the poetry. So negative descriptions might be used by people who said that the Abbasid era poetry is better, and Abu Nuwas, for instance, and Abbasid era poetry includes quite a lot of these negative descriptions of pre-Islamic life to argue that his poetry, and in general the Abbasid poetry, is better than pre-Islamic poetry. These things might be taking place. And then in sort of religious discourse by religious scholars, it is quite often the case that they make the Jahiliyyah or pre-Islamic life and era to be the polar opposite of Islamic more cultured life. So all of these sort of barbarous deeds are ascribed to the pre-Islamic Arabs, polytheism, idolatry, you name it. Those are very commonly ascribed to pre-Islamic Arabians. Then warriors of warfare, that's interesting because it seems to me that in classical Arabic literature, the idea that the best warriors lived in pre-Islamic era and many famous or some of the or many of the famous battles took place in pre-Islamic era. That's sort of that's a point of pride to some Arab authors, it seems, to sort of have these very glorious pre-Islamic past. But then some modern authors, it seems to be, some modern historians have taken this to mean that, okay, life in pre-Islamic Arabia was full of warfare battles, which I'm not sure was taking place. So these can be used in various ways, these narratives, and it's not always clear to which effect and why various classical Muslim scholars are using these narratives or creating these narratives in some cases, because the sort of style and habit of classical Arabic literature is such that you cite a lot of passages, but you rarely say your piece, your own mind, what you really mean by these quotations, what's your own take on these. So that's sort of a matter of style. So it's not always clear what is pride or whether they are somewhat censoring the life in pre-Islamic Arabia or the purported life there. Why these different narratives of, say, warfare and battles are adduced in these sources, but they can be used to many effects, and then modern historians also do that as well.
Yeah, this idea of Jahiliyyah very much seems like a double-edged sword where it's used to elevate on one hand and then it's used to denigrate on the other.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of whose hand the sword is in.
Yeah.
So this is our last question, and thank you. This has been a phenomenal podcast, very interesting. I thought both of your articles were very interesting on the subject. It was very new to me. I've never even rethought or re I've never thought about reassessing this idea of female infanticide in pre-Islamic Arabia. The amount of articles, the amount of videos on YouTube that only confirm this narrative is astounding. And so it's actually really nice to hear a differing voice, and not a voice just trying to be different, but you substantiate it in a wide variety of sources that either confirm your ideas or kind of problematize the idea of waḥd al-banāt. So our last question is, if there's one key takeaway you'd like listeners to remember about your argument on female infanticide in the Quran and pre-Islamic Arabia, what would it be?
Yeah, I think it wouldn't only be about female infanticide, but the whole sort of picture of or control of Jahiliyyah or pre-Islamic Arabia, as we just discussed, has a lot of features, narratives which are unlikely and are probably due to some sort of polemics. They can be sort of intertribal polemics in the Islamic era that really cause some narrative to rise, or then it can be this, larger question of the life in Islamic era among Muslims as being totally different from the pre-Islamic past, which I don't think is the case. There was reform, there was change, but it was gradual and piecemeal rather than full-blown revolution. Funny thing is how these received notions are they stick, and looking at who has cited the article that was published in Jigsaw, the Journal of International Quranic Studies Association, in a few years ago, on this issue. It has been cited by in couple articles, and in all of the articles, the writers adduce it as more evidence that this was taking place. So clearly they hadn't really read it, but and also it shows that conventional stories don't die very easily, and they have a certain stickiness to them.
All right. Well, Ilkka, Dr. Lindstedt, thank you so much for joining us today and walking us through such a fascinating and important re-examination of this topic. We covered a lot of ground, from Quran and poetry to the broader construction of Jahiliyyah, and we really appreciate the depth you brought to this conversation. For our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, share it with others who might be interested, and check out Dr. Lindstedt's article in the Journal of the International Quranic Studies Association for more depth, as well as watch out for his forthcoming article, which we loosely discussed today, that really gets into how female infanticide, this whole discourse about it came to be. Yeah, if there's anything else you'd like to leave us with, I mean, you released a monumental book, Muhammad in Context, that I still see shared all the time, and I still turn back to it when I'm interested in certain aspects of that period. Are you working on anything? Any other books coming out? I know you mentioned the forthcoming article. If you could mention that, if our audience didn't kind of get a little bit of insight from the discussion we had.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Teron and Roxana, for hosting this. This was amazing, even though the subject matter is very, very grim and horrible, but still, I mean, I think we were able to discuss this in a very in-depth manner. I'm working, there are a few forthcoming articles, other ones as well, that discuss both pre-Islamic and early Islamic Arabia, then a couple of book projects, uh, uh, another book on the Prophet Muhammad and his movement, which also takes into account the Sira narratives, which I don't really use much at all in Muhammad and his followers in context. So it tries to be sort of a reading of the Sira narratives and also the Hadith corpus and other types of classical Arabic literature in light of what we know, of the life in pre-Islamic and early Islamic Arabia, with the help of inscriptions and other sort of contemporary materials. Then another book project on early Islamic inscriptions, which hopefully will become sort of a introduction and analysis of the Islamic-era Arabic inscriptions that have been found in Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and other places, and sort of try to put forward ways of dealing with this very rich material, which is accumulating very fast and being published in various ways and documented also in social media by both scholars and amateurs, travelers and locals, you name it. So that's certainly has been fun to write so far, but both books are still there in the back of my mind to a certain extent.
It all sounds interesting, and we can't wait for those releases, even if it takes a couple years. Seems like time moves so fast. I mean, there's
Yeah.
plenty of people who have said, "Yeah, I'm writing this book," and then a couple years later, we invite them on to talk about it, such as Tommaso Tasai.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, thank you for appearing on our podcast. This has been a very interesting and insightful conversation. Hope to speak to you again.
Yeah, thank you both.